All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining today's webinar, Using File Analysis to Drive Information Governance. We're excited that you all could be here today with us. And the first thing I always like to do in the beginning of our webinars is take a second to introduce our speakers. My name is Shayna Horka, and I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at Gimmel. And I'm joined by our key speaker today, Director of Sales Engineering, Dean Meisenheimer. Now, before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. Make sure to keep an eye out for a poll question. I'd say about halfway through the webinar. All answers are anonymous, and we'll go over the results as a group. We're also going to have a live Q&A after today's session, so please feel free to submit questions at any point throughout the webinar, and at the end, we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. If you have any technical difficulties, please send us a message and let us know so we can help you resolve any issues you may be having. To kick things off, I have just one slide here to tell you a little bit about Gimmel. Gimmel is a records, information management, and governance software company that was founded in 2002. We have a client success team and global network of partners that have been delivering solutions with us for more than 17 years. Our primary technology partners are Microsoft and SAP. Our implementation partners include small specialty SIs with specific areas of expertise, as well as large global SIs and consultants like PwC and Lockheed Martin. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into the problem that Gimmel software solves. The reason Gimmel exists is because we recognize that so many enterprises struggle to manage the sheer volume of information and systems they have. For years, they've been adding business applications and information, but haven't been able to create a consistent way to manage the life cycle of their information across these systems or dispose of unneeded or outdated information. This makes doing business more difficult, less secure, and less compliant. Gimmel's family of software products work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive software products include records management, content governance for SharePoint, document management for SAP solutions, and now Altitude, a file analysis solution. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dean so he can get started with the presentation.
Thank you, Shayna. So let's get started. Our focus today is around information governance and file analysis, and really doing that for file systems. One thing we consistently hear from our clients is, how do I understand what I have on my file shares, right? Understanding the chaos of unstructured file systems is difficult. In our webinar last week, during the poll, we asked how many of our users have content or have file shares as one of their content sources. 90% answered yes, right? So a lot of folks still have file shares out there, even though document management, content management, cloud storage has been around for, close to 30 years at this point. The other challenge is we're continuing to create information at a phenomenal rate, right? By 2025, analysts have said 175 zettabytes of data will be created, right, every year. And 80% of that information is going to be unstructured. What doesn't sit in a content management system is going to be sitting on a file share, right? And that's a big challenge. The other big challenge is about a third of that unstructured data is going to be determined to be what's called ROT, redundant, obsolete, or trivial information, right? Information that really doesn't need to be kept. Again, we ask our respondents last week, what percentage of the information in your content sources do you think is ROT? 75% said 25 to 50% of their content was ROT. That's a huge, huge number. And why is that the case? Well, it's because there's chaos out there on the file systems. There's a lack of formal structure, right? I've worked for a number of different companies, both in the software industry as well as other industries over the years. I've never worked any place where there was a corporate standard for naming things on the file share. Maybe in individual work groups or on a project team, we had some structure, right, within the small group. But overall, no, it was kind of roll your own, figure out what you want, name it however you want. And so you wind up with these structures that look something like this. On top of that, the file naming was creative, right? It was up to the users to name files whatever they wanted, and you wind up with structures that, yeah, there was some structure there, but if you didn't know the code, it didn't make any sense, right? What is a file called MK approval, or another file called unsigned mod 3? Mod of what, right? We don't know what the information is. We don't have any context around it. And with a file share, there's not a lot of properties there to help me out. There's a limited amount of system properties, and Gimmel Records Management captures those today, information like the path, the URI, the file name, when was it created, when was it last modified, what folder is it in, who owns it. We can capture all of that information and use it to classify and drive retention on information, but there's no metadata, right? There's no descriptive information about what the file actually is about. And then age and attrition come into play. And I'm not talking about the files. I'm actually talking about the people. The people who created these structures, the people who came up with this creative naming system, at some point they leave the company. People retire. People will change jobs, go to other companies. They'll become entrepreneurs. Outsourcing will happen. But the result of that is you lose your subject matter experts, your SMEs. And there's a brain drain in the organization because of that. Think about your own company, right? Think about your own department. Who's the one or two people in your department you can always go talk to about this project that happened 5 years ago, or what all these files are in this folder over here on the U drive, right? What happens if that person leaves? They're the only ones that know what new gov program was that ran 5 years ago. So we don't have any context. We don't know what our information is, right? We don't know when it was created. We know the last modified date. We may have a created date, but if the file got copied, that's not accurate. We don't know why it was created. We don't know what's in it, right? We don't know information about it. So if I look at a file that's named 81216 DO6 mod 1 WHAM, what does WHAM mean? Is that an acronym for a product, for a project, the initials of the author, an 80s band? What is it, right? And more importantly, with the advent of privacy acts like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, right? If you do business with companies in Europe, you will fall under GDPR. CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which, by the way, takes effect July 1st. HIPAA, Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, right? Does this document contain information that would fall under any of these privacy regulations or any of the other ones that are out there? Does it contain PII information, Social Security numbers, addresses, phone numbers, driver's license numbers? Does it contain PHI, private health information, right? Is it a medical record? What is it, right? Just really simply, what is it? Is it a contract? Does it contain terms like addendum, arbitration, end of agreement, good faith? That would tell me it's probably a contract. Does it have terms like mil-spec or ANSI, ISO, standard operating procedure? Might be a specification. Or does it say things like FOB, buyer name, ship to, billing address? Could be a purchase order, an invoice, a finance document. Right? If I can get some context around what the information is, I know a lot more about how to manage that. And even more critically, does it contain company confidential information? If I'm a product development company, whether that's high tech, manufacturing, life sciences, does this document talk about products that are still in development, that may be in stealth mode? About drug compounds or drugs that I haven't brought to market yet or haven't even taken into clinical trials. And these documents need to be treated differently than other documents in my organization. Right. Without context, it's hard to know how to treat the information properly. Again, when we ask the question, how many of our customers are looking or have plans to do file analysis as part of their information governance strategy. Last week, almost 40% said they didn't have any plans today. And if you don't have plans to do analytics, how do you know what the information is so you can put the right retention around it? I can put broad retention based on those properties I know, but how do I get more granular? And that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, we're going to put a poll question out here for you. So, does your information governance plan include, and you can choose all that apply, semi-structured information, structured information like you would find in a database, rows and columns, unstructured information like what would be sitting out on a file share, or do you not have an information governance plan? Take a minute, select every one that matters. As you can see, we do take the results. We'll show you the results of this poll during the webinar today, and we use that information for our product marketing efforts to decide, what's important to our customers, to share that information in future webinars, right? So it's valuable information, both for you and for us. So we'll give everybody just a moment here to finish voting, and then we'll share the results. All right, and here we go. Semi-structured, 44%. Structured is about a third. Unstructured is about 1/3. And again, close to half do not have an information governance plan in place today, right? So interesting information. The ones that do have a plan, it's kind of seems to be hitting a reasonable amount of all the different information, but a high percentage don't have a plan in place. So let's move on. The good news is there's a way to solve the problem. By combining file analytics with records management, I can put an end-to-end solution in place to manage my file share content properly. It starts with crawling the data sources, going out, identifying what's out there, crawling through my network file shares, traversing the paths, looking at the files, and then analyzing the data that I find. Right, putting together analytic workflows that can analyze the data, generate reports, that can use things like regular expressions, look for certain terms, but it can analyze what I find and then take those results and one, generate reports that I can view, but two, then run through a classification process. And not a records classification process, but just a classification process of saying, I've analyzed this document, I found the terms FOB, buyer name, and ship to, I think this is a purchase order. Or I have found agreement, end of life, and force majeure, I think this is a contract. Or I see a pattern that looks like a social security number. This document likely contains PII information. Right? It can assign those labels and actually write those labels into the header information of the document, and then Gimmel Records Management can take that information and apply policy at a more granular level than what we can do with just the file share properties out of the box. The way we do this is with Gimmel Altitude classification. Right? We're not going to go through all of Altitude today. You can go back and view a recorded webinar from last week, but Altitude allows me to set up labels. I can come in and define any number of labels that I want. The labels may be unique to my company. They may be unique to my industry. It could be from a standard taxonomy, industry taxonomy. But I can create my own labels, and then I can set up analytic workflows that will go through and analyze the documents and assign the labels. Once the policies have executed, I get a report that shows me the results. I also get dashboards that show me the information visually, and I'll get a set of exceptions that are shown. Once I have that information, Gimmel Records Management can now look to Altitude and its index file instead of having to go crawl the file share again. So the universal file share connector for Gimmel Records Management can be configured to look directly at the Altitude index. And now it can leverage all of the properties that altitude captured, along with the labels that altitude has assigned as a result of its analysis. And when we have our file system content in Gimmel Records Management, we can now look at the properties for any record. And not only do we know the same type of properties we knew before, hey, it's on the file share, here's when it was modified, here's its location on the file share. We can now pick up information like the altitude label. Based on the altitude analytics, this document contains personal health information. Now I can classify that document differently. I can manage it differently. And so let's take a look at that in a demonstration. Oops. All right, and my screensaver conveniently kicked in here. So let's get logged in. All right, so this is Gimmel altitude, and this is the classification screen in altitude. Same screen you saw on the slide. As I mentioned, I've created a set of labels, and then you can do that over here on the left-hand side of the menu. So I can create any number of labels, again, that are relevant to my organization, to my industry, whatever I need. That's just done right through the menu. Once I have my labels created, I can set up my analytic workflows. So here's where I can come in, set up a workflow that will go out and crawl my file system path. And if we take a quick glance at the workflow here, I can have it go through and process the paths, process the folders, get down to the individual files. And then as we find each file, we can run our different tests. Test for Social Security number. Look for terms like SSN or Social Security. If you find it, I want you to come in and assign the label PII to it. Go look for credit. If you don't find that, go look for credit card information. Use a regular expression that would match MasterCard or Visa or American Express or Discover numbers. And if you find that, now I want you to classify the file as containing PII information. But what if we want to go out and test for information like contracts or invoices? Again, I can walk through each test, move to the next test. If it doesn't find it, it moves to the next test. Look for an invoice. Look for bill to or buyer name. And again, if you find any of those terms, tag it as an invoice or a PO. So we can run through all of these analytic sequences, and when we get done, we get a list of results. And here's a report that shows every file. I had 169 items labeled. Every file that's been labeled, the same information we would know through crawling it in Gimmel Records Management. Where is it at? It's on the file share. Here's the file name. Here's the location of where that file is. Here's the created date, the modified date. All of that same file share property information, but now we know additional information. Here's the snippet of the file that matched my condition that said this might contain PII data. It looks like what could be a Social Security number. Here's the full text of the document if I want to take a look at it and give it a quick glance and make a determination. Right? This all becomes the information now that Gimmel Records Management can use to do records classification, retention, and apply legal holds. And if there were documents that were exceptions, couldn't be analyzed, I see that as well. These are two documents that were scanned, probably without any OCR data, so they're images wrapped inside of a PDF. Now, Gimmel Records Management, as I mentioned, for managing file share content, can now look to the altitude index to import all of the information about my files. So we can read that index, we can see where the documents are, we can see what they are, and we can now treat them just like if it had had to go out and crawl the file system itself, except now we have more context about the information. As I go to my Manage screen, where I can see all of my records being managed in Gimmel Records Management, I can view it in a list, or I can view it by record class. I happen to know I have some purchasing invoices out there that were captured by altitude. And if we come in and click to take a look, here we can see there's a number of different invoices. The difference now is when we look at the properties for those invoices, what we're going to see is altitude looked into the file. Altitude captured all of the same type of information that Gimmel Records Management typically is captured, but we now also have that one missing piece we didn't have before. We have the context of what the file is. We don't just know it's sitting in a folder called POs. We know that it is an invoice because we found all the right information to tell us that it was an invoice. If we wanted to go look at other files, we can come in and go take a look at, for example, contracts. Maybe I come into my legal documents, I come down here and look at my contracts, and maybe I have contracts that didn't match any of my other rules. But again, through Gimmel Altitude, I can come in here, I can look at the properties, and Altitude has found terms in this document that tells me it's most likely a contract. Now, I can review that, I can take a look at it, and I can, I can reclassify it if it's not correct. The nice thing about this is I can come in, whoops, clicked one too quick there. I can use those labels now to do things like create rules for my legal holds. Here I have a legal hold. We're being sued because an ex-employee says we disclosed their personal information. So now maybe I want to come in and I want to set up rules on my legal hold where I'm looking for any document, any record that Gimmel Records Management is aware of, that the path to that record has the term benefits in the path, and where Altitude has now analyzed this file and said it contains PII information. Any record I have that matches these two conditions will now get put onto this legal hold. I can do the same thing for my records classification and my retention life cycles. Again, if we want to come in, we can create classification rules on our record classes. Now I'm in the file plan management area of Gimmel Records Management. Here's my purchasing invoices record class. You can see we have classification rules. We have a retention life cycle assigned. And our classification rules leverage the Altitude labels. So here we're simply saying, if the record is coming in from the file system, if the Altitude label is equal to invoice PO, I want it assigned to this record class, PUR03, my invoices, where it will then inherit the life cycle that's assigned to this record class. If we go take a look at my contract example that we showed a moment earlier, I can do the same thing. Here's my legal contracts. You can see I've got record classes already set up for my general contracts and for my property contracts and for my supplier contracts. But what if there's other information that doesn't match and I want to get classification on that until I have a chance to review it and maybe make better decisions about it? I can use the Altitude information to come in here and create rules to handle kind of the exceptions or the ones that don't match my other rules. Now we're doing things like if it came in from the file share and the path is not contracts in the contracts folder, or the path is not the property contracts folder, but Altitude said it's a contract, well, let's assign it to this record class. So at least now it's classified, we can get retention on it, and then we can make a decision. Is that where it needs to be managed? Does it need to be moved somewhere else? What do we do with this? Right? And then lastly, even things like retention triggers can be triggered by Altitude labels. I can have triggers that trigger on any type of date, any type of property, triggered off of events, and I can very easily create a retention trigger that looks at an Altitude label and says if the Altitude label is PII, now maybe I combine this with a retention period, with another set of rules, and then ultimately a disposition action that may happen. Right? So we're coming up towards the bottom of the hour. This is one of our 30-minute topical webinars. I'm going to flip back into the slide deck here for a moment, and then we'll open it up for questions. So to kind of wrap it, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, the key benefits of the combination of Gimmel Altitude and Gimmel Records Management. One, I can simply analyze my file share content and I can get rid of my rot, right? Second, I can discover and govern my data more effectively because I now know what it is. I can remediate sensitive data because I can identify PHI, PII, confidential information. I can classify my discovered content using my policies, using my labels, and then I can integrate that into Gimmel records management to make my records classification and my retention even more effective. So with that, let's open it up for questions. I see a number of questions in the chat panel. I see a number of questions in, yeah. Shana, do you want to read them or you want me to just go through them?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go ahead and read them. So the first question we have is there any opportunity to use machine learning to classify documents instead of being required as users to configure a library of specific tests for document content that results in a classification label?
Good question. It's something that's, it's something that's being looked at today. The policies are specifically configured to go look for specific things so that you don't have to go through the training steps and everything else you typically do with machine learning. But I think that's something you will see as the machine learning becomes more effective, as some of the tools, the cloud services that are out there become even more effective. I think you'll see that get incorporated more, where potentially I could call machine learning engine as part of an analytic workflow. So.
Great. And the next one is, assume we have 1,000 unique contracts, each being a multi-document case. Does Altitude have any way to differentiate contract 1 from contract 2, etc.?
Let's see, 1,000 contracts, and I have to make a couple of assumptions here. Each contract being multiple documents, so like a compound document, I would assume. The way Altitude could potentially differentiate these 3 documents make up contract 1 and these 10 documents make up contract 2 could be by terms in the document that it could find. But it would analyze each document individually and apply the labels and run its data governance policies. That doesn't mean that when the document gets indexed by Gimmel Records Management, depending on the combination of the properties and the Altitude labels, those contracts couldn't be assigned into a single case and managed as a compound record, so to speak. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. And the next one, if you apply a classification to a file on a file share, what happens if you later move that file to SharePoint?
If you move the file into SharePoint, let me think this one through a little bit. So if you classify a file on the file share, that's part of the properties of the document on the file share, and Gimmel Records Management will pick that up. If you move it into SharePoint later on, it's going to pick up a content type. It's going to pick up some metadata and SharePoint properties now. And that's what Gimmel Records Management will pick up because we have a lot more information now to work with. We have that context. We know things like site collection name, library name, folder name, content type. Even if it's just a document, we know file name and title. If you're using other metadata or retention labels in Microsoft 365, we have all that data as well. So it's a little different problem at that point.
The next one is, how much and what type of training is needed for high accuracy?
That goes back to the machine learning question. The nice thing is there's not training that's needed, obviously beyond user training, but the system doesn't need to be fed sample documents, right, to train it to understand. You're essentially setting up workflows, and if you go back and look at last week's webinar, it kind of talks a little bit in more detail there. I can use any type of regular expression. So if you've ever worked with regular expressions, that gives me a tremendous amount of power to narrow down what I look for and how I look for it. I can combine that with string searches. I can use all type of other properties in the workflow. So it doesn't need, to be fed, 100 or 500 or 1,000 sample documents of contracts to understand what a contract is.
Okay, and I'll pull one from the chat here. It's how well do these applications play with Office 365 and all the tentacles like Microsoft Teams?
Altitude can do data governance and classification against content in Microsoft 365, in SharePoint, in OneDrive, in Exchange. So it can go out and identify and find content in Shayna's inbox, for example, that contains certain terms, or crawl my SharePoint sites and tell me there are documents out there that reference a product that's still in stealth mode, for example. So it absolutely supports those content sources, which is something we talked about in the last week, a little bit out of the scope for today's webinar, but they're absolutely supported by the workflows and the policies.
Great, and one that says, I may have missed this, so apologies if it was said, but do you have to provide the terms that Altitude searches for within documents? Or are the search terms for analyzing for PII, contracts, etc., already built by Gimmel?
Good question. Our customer success team has built lists of kind of common HR terms, for example, common contract terms, which is actually where I got my list from for the demo. So they've begun building that, because obviously we see this with a lot of clients. So we can provide, I think, the basics as part of an implementation. There's not like a library of terms that come as part of the licensing, but something obviously that we could look at providing. And then obviously that would always be augmented by company-specific terms or acronyms that you may use, because every company has its own language internally.
Great, and there's a question here concerning the cost and pricing plan.
I'm not a sales guy, so if you want to find out more about the cost and the licensing and how it's priced, reach out through sales@gimmel.com and we can get you some specifics, because it's a terrible answer, but it depends a bit on what you want to do and the different number of data sources.
And it looks like we had another one about the cost, so you answered that. And the last one we have is, how do you handle non-OCR images? Does Altitude require a third-party tool?
Yeah, if you have images sitting out on a file share, like my two exceptions you saw there, those were image files that were in a PDF wrapper. There was no information in the PDF beyond the header information to analyze, right? Because they hadn't been OCR'd. So Altitude does not do, Altitude will do OCR of documents that already have, information available. It is not going to do image OCR. So for that, you would need, to run some type of OCR tool against your file share for Altitude to be able to process it, whether that's a capture tool or just a standalone OCR.
Great, well, that wraps up the questions. Dean, if you want to put it to the next slide, so those individuals inquiring about price can get the contact information. If anyone has any further questions, or if you want to receive a personalized demo that Dean will probably do for you, please feel free to email any one of us, or you can contact us through our website or at sales@gimmel.com. And for those interested in the recording of this webinar, we're going to send it out via email to everyone who attended within 24 to 48 hours. And that concludes our webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.